Yes, welcome in. We're back, and Jesse's back. Hey, Jesse, how you doing?
Doing well. I'm glad that every time I leave, they just get a four-star player. That's what I texted you last week. Maybe I should go out of town more often.
There's two of them, wasn't it?
I know. So you're welcome, Badgers fans.
Yeah, we deliver news, we deliver recruits just based on what we do. Like I assume, as soon as we get done recording this, they'll have another recruit commit to them. That's just the way things go. But last week we did a show on Thursday, I believe, and then obviously we knew Mason Posa was going to be committing very soon after that, and Eugene Hill. Or did we do it Wednesday? Either way, this is going back to that Wednesday Thursday thing that I really messed up last week as well. Let's not try to get into days, but they got Mason Posa, the top guy on their board at that moment, and then Eugene Hilton Jr. the next day, and then Wilnerson Telemake earlier this week. So Wisconsin adds 3 recruits since last time we had to do a show, or last time we did a show, I should say. And I think obviously Mason Post is the headliner, but I'm really intrigued by the other 2 as well.
Yeah, they were at a point a week and a half ago where it was a pretty solid class, but all the guys who were still out there that were not committed, that were on their board, they'd gotten in for official visits, they were there. And you thought if they could get even some of them, it will take the class to another level. And obviously, they're not going to end up with every guy who took an official, but to get Mason Posa and then to follow that right up with Eugene Hilton, who's the son of T.Y. Hilton, is a really good player, someone they really needed on the outside. And then to add to your defensive line haul after they were able to flip Torrin Petaway back from Minnesota, it shows, to me, it has taken this class to a new level. They're sitting there at least at this point, 5 4-star players in the 24/7 composite and 20 commitments. And obviously there's a couple more still out there, but it shows all the work and the effort that this staff has done, because there are not a lot of programs out there that at this point essentially have their class wrapped up. And even before this recruiting staff came in, I thought when Wisconsin took another step in recruiting, that is what helped to separate the Badgers, was identifying prospects early, getting them on campus, and getting those early commitments. Now, as we've seen, they're still going to have to fend a lot of schools off until the early signing period in December, but very impressed with what Wisconsin has been able to do so far.
Yeah, and they've got as you mentioned, a few more guys that are at least we have dates for them to be committing. Nicholas Clayton, the outside linebacker, is going to be committing, I believe, tomorrow, Saturday. And then Drayden Pavey, who just recently visited Wisconsin, is going to be committing July 2nd. He's down to Indiana, Purdue, and Wisconsin. And then there's obviously a few others. The running back, Byron Lewis. Which one are we going with? Because when I talked to Evan, I had Evan Flood on Friday to talk about Mason Posa, and he said Louis. So I don't know which one to go with. What do you think?
If he says it, let's do it.
All right,
Byron
Byron Louis.
Wrong, we'll tease him for it.
Of course, and even if it's right, we'll tease him.
Yes.
So the running back, obviously here at some point, Zay Gentry, the cornerback who's committed to SMU, but obviously Wisconsin's still trying to get him as part of their class, and there's a few others as well, right?
Yeah, there are. It's filling up very quickly. I know I've said this before. The goal each year has been the 18 to 22. They're right in the middle there. But obviously, when you have those high-end Plan A priority guys that you get in on official visits in the first and second weekend, I don't think you're in a position where you're going to say no. Then again, some of these spots fill up. But like with Clayton, the outside linebacker, they have 2 outside linebackers committed. They have Brendan Ains. They have Samuel Ladaju from New Jersey, but would take a third if it can be an impact playmaker like him and Jaden Woods, who's another guy who took an official on the first weekend. And on the defensive line, I don't think you can have enough talent on the defensive line if you can get it. How many times have we talked about that the Badgers don't have enough firepower there or need more in recruiting? So if you can get a player there that is a high-end guy, you would take him. And the rest, and maybe even at those positions, feels like gravy at this point. I mean, if you can flip a Zay Gentry, that's a big deal for them, though they have a lot in the secondary. There's still some other positions, but they're pretty much wrapped up here, and we'll know in the next couple of weeks what the final number probably will be when it comes to high school recruiting.
Yeah, and again, you're filling, like, they have a lot of seniors this year, right? So you're filling a lot of holes with those guys, but you always know that there's going to be others that leave. So even if that 20, whatever the number ends up being, it could even get above where Luke Fickell wants to be, right? Like 18 to 22. It could be even more than that this year, just simply because of how many seniors they have. And we know the transfer portal as well is going to play a role in exactly how this all looks at the end of it. Switching gears here a little bit, staying with the recruiting aspect of things, but there was a story out, what was that, Thursday morning from Football Scoop that Wisconsin was looking to add to their recruiting department, right? They were looking to add, potentially going after a kid named Carter Almond. He is currently at Notre Dame, and Notre Dame fans were freaking out because of how good he's been for them. Wisconsin fans were also freaking out because the title that he was being pursued for was director of personnel, which currently is held by Max Steinecker, which has been a huge boon for Wisconsin's recruiting these past couple of years. I know a lot of people have been impressed what he's done. I think, I mean, I can only speak for myself here, but I've been impressed with what he's done. But Wisconsin, so it's like, all right, is he moving on? And no, he's not. He's staying, and that, according to, was first reported by Colton Bartholomew at the Wisconsin State Journal, that he's staying. He's getting a new title, and we'll see exactly how that plays out. But that whole Carter Almond thing was gone within a few hours, right? Like Notre Dame, nope, we want to keep him, so we're going to pony up and take him. But Wisconsin's adding to the recruiting department. What do you think that means? What do you think it says about Wisconsin and the commitment they have to recruiting to add even more bodies into what they have really piled a lot of bodies into here compared to what it was before?
If you're a Wisconsin fan, it's a great thing. What is the lifeblood of a program? Well, now it's a transfer portal, but it's also recruiting, and that department handles both of those things. And in order to get Wisconsin to the level that people believe is possible, you've got to continue to add talent. And of course, I'm with you. I've been so impressed with what this staff has been able to do. It's Max Steinecker, it's Pat Lambert, Casey Robach certainly deserves a ton of credit as well. And they have other people on staff that help them. But those are the three that present themselves, as they did it in December during the early signing period, to tell you all about the class. The first full recruiting class that Wisconsin had under Luke Fickell in 2024 had 11 four-star 24/7 composite signees. That's the highest and the most they've ever had. It was a top 25 class, which is only the second time that has happened. And as we've just been discussing, in 2025, they've done a lot of work. They've got, like I said, the 5 four-star composite players with the potential to add a couple more. And it feels like with the transfer portal, they've attempted to upgrade at multiple positions. But I think it would have been a significant blow to lose Max, but to have him still there with his knowledge and expertise and energy and enthusiasm, and potentially add someone else as a director of player personnel that you would assume would fit a similar mold, just like they were trying to do at Notre Dame, maybe a young go-getter who has proven himself in a short time period. It just makes them stronger. I know we've talked ad nauseum in recent years about where this recruiting department was at the tail end, maybe a year or so before the end of the Paul Chryst era, and that's obviously unacceptable. You need more horses, not less, when it comes to recruiting. So I think this speaks to where Wisconsin is trying to go, what Luke Fickell wants to build here, and it's never a bad thing to add if it fits the pieces to the puzzle.
I'm interested to see what that new position is for Max. Like, is it still going to be involved in recruiting? You would think it would be, right? Like, that's kind of his thing, but maybe it's not as intense, maybe, as the role that he has now. Like, it just feels like both him and Pat and the other folks that are in there in that recruiting department, it's nonstop, right? I mean, you have the transfer portal, especially with the transfer portal, it's just absolutely nonstop from, I mean, do you get July off a little bit? Kind of like, is it kind of like everybody else in football, both college and pro, where, you get done with official visits in June and you kind of get a few weeks? Because it's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, it's speculation on my part about what exactly the role would be, but I don't anticipate that meaning any less work or effort. But I did a story on Max and Pat last year, the first few months they were here, and was talking to them about what a typical day looks like. And part of what they like is that there is no typical day, but the hours are absurd. I mean, they're in there before the sun comes up a lot of times and are leaving there often. And maybe this was more so early on because they had so much work to do, but I imagine it's pretty similar now, sometimes leaving when the sun has gone down. you're basically spending almost every waking moment in there. You're trying to prep, get your agenda in order so you can present it to the coaches. So sometimes they're there before the coaches, and then they're there all day, and they're following prospects, and they're organizing conversations with these prospects so they can get the coaches on the phone. I mean, they would spend like 2 or 3 hours in the afternoons setting up these calls with players to get them on the phone with the coaches. And you've seen the fruits of their labor, but recruiting never stops. So you can pat yourself on the back about, oh, look at that 2024 class. It's a top 25 group. And then you start over with 2025. And as we're seeing, they're sending out offers to 2026 and 2027. And you have the transfer portal, which is more important, certainly of equal importance, but more important, particularly in the short term, to impact the program. So it really just never ends. So you have to love it.
Right. So I'm wondering if maybe the college game, and there are programs that are already doing this, but with the addition of schools being able to pay players, is it a thing where maybe, in the NFL you have your coach and then you have your general manager, and he's the one that obviously makes those big decisions. Certainly Luke Fickell is going to continue to make the decisions as the face of the program, but maybe you have like a general manager that is going to manage that whole aspect of player personnel, like money wise and everything else.
I certainly think everything is on the table with the way the landscape has shifted.
And I'm not saying that's Max. I'm just saying, like, in general for college, I mean, it just feels like you need the head coach has to wear so many different hats now that maybe he finds somebody that he feels comfortable with. And obviously he still has the final say, but he feels comfortable with putting in charge of overseeing so many aspects of the program that are just too much for a coach, because a coach, look, it's a transfer portal, it's recruiting, it's on field, it's off field. Like it has to wear every single hat. And not that the coach hasn't always kind of, been that guy, but there's just so much more to it now.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to run it like you do a professional sports team, because it essentially has become professional sports where you got to manage salary caps. So I think the challenge in college football right now is you don't necessarily know what your cap is. We've got a lot of changes to this landscape with the NCAA ruling. And is every school going to get $20 million? And how do you allocate those resources? And how much money do you have coming in through the collective? But I think the more you do it, the larger sample size you have and the better idea and understanding you have of what the resources will be financially, and then how do you divvy it up. But absolutely, that's got to be a part of this equation and has been. And the more ways you can divide responsibilities, the better. I thought it was interesting, even when Max and Pat got here, that they essentially split their responsibilities down the middle. Now, they had different areas of expertise. You had a general manager of big scale, which was kind of how Max handled things. And you had Pat handling different positions like defensive back, but Pat was a defensive back way back when at Cincinnati. And then Casey was handling the line play and also quarterbacks, which I thought was really interesting, although I'm sure Phil Longo had something to do with it. So that to me shows the importance of understanding how you divide those responsibilities. And that I imagine will be part of this equation as well.
All right, let's switch gears here a little bit and talk some Wisconsin schedule. The Badgers, I wanted to go through this. Obviously, it's June, right? So when I think about trying to find things to talk about at the end of June, let's go through this schedule. I emailed you last night. I told you this is what we're going to do. We're going to pick game by game. We're going to go game by game. Let's find Wisconsin's record. It's June 21st. So, there are a lot of things that could happen between now and September, or now and August 30th. But let's start with that August 30th opener versus Western Michigan, the night game, the Friday night game against Western Michigan. Who you got?
Well, I think this is great off-season fodder, especially as we get to the point where we've just been hanging around waiting for something else to develop. Big Ten Media Days is a few weeks out, and obviously preseason practices start at the beginning of August. But we've been talking about the schedule overall for a long time. As soon as we realized that there were going to be 4 new teams coming from the Pac-12 and how it was going to impact Wisconsin. And I've said for a while, I think Wisconsin will be a better football team, and yet it might not necessarily be reflected in the record. Having said that, getting to the opener, I think Wisconsin wins this one. It's a Friday night game. It's one of those where I think, man, if Wisconsin somehow loses, Lord help everybody for what this season will be. But I think the Badgers they look better in a lot of the areas that they struggled in last season, and they better show it right out of the gate.
So Western Michigan is an interesting team to open up. It's only interesting for me because of the last time they opened up against Western Michigan at night on a weekday came after one of the more tumultuous days in program history when the shoebox suspensions came down and Wisconsin was trying to appeal them and get them so that guys could play, and they ended up having it was in excess of 30 guys, and they had to stagger the suspensions. The suspensions were from like 1 to 3 games, and just a ton of guys were suspended for that opener, and it was ugly. It was ugly. And the only reason, one of the only reason Wisconsin won, I think it was 19-7. Maybe that score might be wrong, but Josh Hunt, a walk-on, essentially serving in place of Nick Davis, who I think was serving one of his game suspensions that night, returned to punt. It is the second warmest game in Wisconsin in Camp Randall history, right behind the UNLV game of 2011. And the only thing I remember is how hot it was, the shoebox scandal, and Josh Hunt. So all that said, I'm going to take Wisconsin in the opener. But the last time it happened, I mean, all I'm saying is that you're hoping that you're not going to have some of the same anything off the field happen that is affecting you that night. You're hoping not to have a repeat of that night. The second game, South Dakota, FCS opponent, but it is a good FCS opponent. It's a top 10, going to probably start the year in the top 10 in the FCS. And we know that some of the South Dakota States, North Dakota States have always been a little bit of a thorn in the side of a certain team down to, I guess, our Southwest, giving them some games in openers, or not in openers, but early in the season. Who you got?
Well, I've got Wisconsin in this one. You schedule an FCS game for a reason. It's a money game, and you better win it. And this, to me, it better be the perfect tune-up to give your guys enough playing time that you feel confident going into what it's going to be like a week later. I do think, though, and we've seen this, those types of teams can give Wisconsin trouble when the Badgers are not at their best. My best example is the 2012 year when Danny O'Brien made his debut and Northern Iowa came in, and it took everything that Wisconsin had to win that. I want to say it was something like 26-21, and I think that was O'Brien's debut, and he was pretty good from what I remember. But this, to me, has to be a game that Wisconsin wins fairly handily. Otherwise, you're looking at the rest of the schedule going, uh-oh.
Threw for a bunch of yards. I believe he also threw maybe an interception or two. Either way, that was the game that it was like, all right, you're coming off the Russell Wilson season, and you're like, all right, got this quarterback from the ACC back-to-back years. You got Monte Ball, you got James White, you got Melvin Gordon, you got Jared Aberdaris, you got all these guys that you got an offensive line that's just going to tear people up. And yeah, that offense, not ideal, not great, especially throwing the ball. But Danny O'Brien was not Russell Wilson, I think is, I guess, my point. Yeah, it didn't work out for him. But yes, they beat. It was Northern Iowa, right? And yeah, I'm going to take Wisconsin against South Dakota. But again, I think it's a game that could give Wisconsin trouble, just because I think South Dakota is a solid team. And so when you think about that, and you think about what's happening the following week, could it be a look ahead? It's a spot. It's a bit of a cliche, but could it be a look ahead when you have Alabama come in the next week? So I again, Wisconsin 2-0, going to start the season 2-0, and then they take on Alabama. Big Fox noon kickoff, whatever they call that thing. That's actually 11 a.m. here in Wisconsin. It's a tough game. It's going to be one of the first big games, I guess, for Kalen DeBoer. Did they play Texas? I don't think they played Texas this year. They played Texas the past 2 years, but it's going to be one of his first big challenges, but also just a huge challenge for Wisconsin.
This, to me, is, I know there are more important games because it is a non-conference game, but this feels like the most pivotal game of the Luke Fickell era so far, just because it's an inflection point to help us understand where this program really is at. And we saw last season how far the Badgers had to go. I think of I mean, the last time Wisconsin played Alabama, it wasn't really fair. It was, Alabama won the national title that year in 2015, and it was Paul Christ's first game. But you just saw the difference. This Crimson Tide over the course of 4 quarters just absolutely steamrolled the Badgers, and you could see the disparity in talent level. The good news this time is it's not at a neutral site; it's at Camp Randall Stadium. I think Wisconsin has a chance, certainly, to beat Alabama, but I am picking the Crimson Tide. I feel like at this point, with what I feel about Wisconsin, they are going to have to show me that they are worthy of being picked in a game like this, because Wisconsin has not won these kinds of games for several years at this point. So it's hard for me to sit here in June and say I'm I'm straight up going to pick the Badgers, but that doesn't mean it can't happen. So if they do win, to me, it changes the entire complexion of this season. And if they lose, it's kind of like it's what most people expected. Wisconsin can still have a good season, but they're not there yet in terms of being at a level where they can be great.
When is the last time they won a game like this?
Well, I assume that Alabama will be a top 10 team. They don't have a ton of opportunities to play top 10 non-conference games at home. I mean, they beat Nebraska in 1974 when obviously Nebraska was not part of the Big Ten and the Cornhuskers were number 4 in the country. So that might even be the last time there was a top 10 non-conference opponent at Camp Randall Stadium. There have been more important games since then, but that shows you how rare it is for this kind of opportunity.
Yeah, again, when you look at this, Alabama plays Western Kentucky and they play South Florida in their first 2 games. And then they come to Wisconsin. I think if this is Nick Saban, I wouldn't give Wisconsin a chance. If this was the continuity, right? Like, and you had just the machine that has been Alabama since Nick Saban came back and took over, I would say Wisconsin doesn't have a chance. Kalen DeBoer, maybe still working some stuff out. Obviously, Jalen Milroe was fantastic down the stretch last year, and that's going to be such a huge challenge because Wisconsin has not always dealt well with quarterbacks that can move around. But I mean, that's a lot of teams when it's when it's a guy as freaky as Jalen Milroe, and he throws the deep ball so well, and they had so many explosive plays last year. Has he taken a step with some of the shorter throws? We'll see, and some of the intermediate throws, but like, where does Wisconsin match it up? And then also, obviously, defensively, they lost a ton. Alabama did. They lose a ton every year. And I just wonder, kind of like Wisconsin, certainly starting from a different spot, right? Because they have so much more talent than Wisconsin did at this time last year. But it takes a little bit for you to hit the ground running. I should say it takes a little bit. You're not always going to hit the ground running. And I think that could be the case from Alabama. Still, having said that, I'm gonna take Alabama just because it is Alabama. And as you said, show me you can compete in these games. Show me you can stay in these games. And, then I think maybe we change our outlook in terms of how you view Wisconsin and Luke Fickell. It's just, when I asked the question about when's the last time they won one of these type of games, I guess I'm talking about Big Ten, bowl, or otherwise, like not just non-conference home games, but like, when's the last time they beat a big-time opponent? I mean, you could say Michigan in 2019, but Michigan wasn't that great in 2019, so that's a little tough. Michigan 2017.
2017 is probably my answer, to be honest. And I was going through the schedule for another topic that we were considering discussing and might discuss later and there really have not been a lot of noteworthy games for Wisconsin where the Badgers showed up in recent years. And in 2017, I mean, you know how fond I am of that Orange Bowl victory against Miami, but at the very least, like, that was a big time win against a Miami team that until a few weeks earlier was considered a potential title contender. It was in Hard Rock, it was in Miami, and they had a few of those types of wins. And since then, we haven't seen it. The 2018 team wasn't particularly good, underwhelmed. 2019 was a solid team, but didn't win those big time matchups, got destroyed against Ohio State, couldn't win the Rose Bowl in a very entertaining game. Obviously didn't win the Big Ten championship. And we know what's happened since 2020. So it's been a little while. I mean, they did beat LSU at Lambeau Field, but it turned out that LSU team wasn't very good.
Right. You know what? They ended up going, I know they fired Les Miles. They ended up winning like 8 or 9 games, didn't they?
I think they went like 8-4 or something like that. And
Yeah,
again, I don't have the
not
number right in front of me, but they were a top 5 team at the time, or top 10 team. And so it was like, oh, this is a transformative type of victory. And it turned out LSU wasn't as good as people thought.
yeah, and then obviously they were fifth, and then a few weeks later Wisconsin went to Michigan State when they were eighth. Now that Michigan State team turned out to be absolute nothing.
Right off the cliff.
Yeah, just not very good. And then the last time they had like home matchups against top 5 teams outside of Ohio State was Michigan in 2016, and they were unable to get that one right. They lost on the road in what was a really poor offensive performance, but a really good Michigan defense. You know what they beat Minnesota when they were in the top 10, but I'm talking like marquee opponent. Like Minnesota was in the top 10 in 2019, but that wasn't a marquee opponent, right? Like when I think marquee opponent, I'm thinking Michigan, I'm thinking Ohio State, I'm thinking Penn State, I'm thinking Alabama, LSU. So yeah, I mean it's a huge opportunity. It's obviously not the only one that they have this year, right? We'll get to the other ones, but starting out, I would say 2-1 to start out those first 3 games, and then they get the week off, and then they go to USC to face the Trojans, and in a game that, again, you look at it and you're saying it's USC. I don't think does Wisconsin really have a shot, and then you can kind of talk yourself into maybe them having a shot.
I could go either way on this at this point. When we're having this discussion, it feels close to a coin flip. Obviously, USC doesn't have Caleb Williams anymore. The defense last season was not very good, but they've reloaded and they have a ton of talent. And I think it will be good for Wisconsin to have a bye week to prepare for this. It's the first Big Ten game of the season for the Badgers. Right now, though, I'm going to pick USC. But this, again, much like I said about Alabama, is another one of those so-called inflection points for Wisconsin, because if they lose to Alabama and beat USC, the loss to Alabama really doesn't change a ton other than suddenly they'd shoot into the top 15. But you still, because we're in an era where there's a 12-team college football playoff, can lose a game like the Alabama one and beat USC and put yourself in a really good position for later on in this season. But as of now, I think Wisconsin will be 2-2 overall and 0-1 in the Big Ten.
Yeah, it's a tough one for me. Again, USC's defense was they lost how many? They lost 4 games or 5 games last year with Caleb Williams as the quarterback. Like, how does that happen? That's that's like Russell Wilson, like losing the games with Russell Wilson at quarterback, because your defense sucks. Now, again, Wisconsin has USC's defensive coordinator as their safeties coach, but it's different, right? Like if he's not calling plays, it's completely different. I think, I don't think we need to dive into that. We've talked about that in the past, but new quarterback threw up a ton of yards and a ton of touchdowns in their bowl game. Yes. Miller Moss did, but I want to pick Wisconsin. I do, but I'm not going to. I'm going to be very weak here and say 2-2 to start. But I think that game at USC, you said a coin flip. I think I can agree with that, because just how bad USC's defense was last year. If that hasn't gotten fixed, if that is still a major issue for them, they're going to struggle this year, no matter what they do offensively. I mean, they had one of the greatest offenses in the world last year, and they still lost as many games as they did. I'm going to take USC, but I don't feel good about it. I don't at all. So we both have Wisconsin 2-2 after the first 4 weeks. They will take on Purdue in it's 5th game. I guess it's week 6.
I'm going to hit the next 3 just right now. I don't know if we need to go one by one on all 12. It might be a 2-hour-long podcast. I think this is a stretch where Wisconsin can go and should go 3-0. I think they will beat Purdue at home. This has been a remarkable streak, and there are times where Purdue probably should have won, but the Badgers haven't lost, what was it, 2004? Or 2003? The 2004, they won, and they haven't lost since. The Rutgers game, to me, it's kind of like what we've seen every year that Wisconsin should win. The one at Northwestern is the one that always gives me pause, because the Wildcats have just been trouble for Wisconsin. And I'm honestly more excited to watch that game in person than most of these, just because of the location. That 3 of the 4 sides are going to be right on the lake. And I don't know if anybody's going to be able to throw a pass more than 20 yards. For the game itself, though, I think this is a stretch where Wisconsin can start to show what will be different this year. And so as of now, I think at that point in the season, Wisconsin will be 5-2 overall, 3-1 in Big Ten play going into what is going to be an exceptionally difficult stretch.
I know we call each other co-hosts, but I get to decide how we do this. So no, I'm kidding. Purdue, yes, 2003, the last time they lost. That College Game Day was in town. It was the week after Wisconsin had upset Ohio State when they had that 20 some odd game winning streak. And there was a block kick that got returned for a touchdown. It was a bad day. The Ohio State game in 2003 was easily the high mark of the season, considering they also lost to UNLV at home and then lost that way to Purdue. But yeah, the 2004 game is the epic game in the series where you have, Orton on the boot. He gets helicoptered, goes the other way. Scott Starks for the touchdown to shock Purdue. And they really, to be fair, haven't recovered since. If you go and look where they were at that point in 2004 to where they are now, or to where they have been for the last 20 years, they just never got back to that point. And I look at that as the spot where it started going down and the two programs started going in different directions. But that's a history lesson we don't need to talk about it, because as you said, we could probably sit here for about 2 hours and talk Wisconsin history with certain teams. But that said, at home, there's guys on this team that were not born the last time Purdue won. I'm going to take Wisconsin at home. At Rutgers is an interesting one. They gave Wisconsin a game at home last year, and if not for that Ricardo Hallman interception right before half and return it for a touchdown, you kind of wonder what that's going to be. They have a familiar face at quarterback. Do you know who their quarterback is?
I don't know what I had for breakfast yesterday, so I should know, but I don't.
What? Oh, Siri's wanting in on this. Yeah, the quarterback now is former Minnesota quarterback Ethan Kaliakmanis. He's their starter, and their starter from last year. Now he's in the I know they're transferred. I'm not sure where he ended up, but either way, at Rutgers, that's a tough one. I guess I'm going to take Wisconsin, but again, not exactly one I feel good about. I feel like Greg Schiano has kind of steadied that ship a little bit, and we'll see how it plays out. But at Northwestern, I hate that field. I mean, I think it's unique.
It's a different field.
No, I'm saying it's unique. I get that. It's unique. But I'd much rather that game be at Lambeau Field, which was the kind of like the story. Like, it got my hopes up, right? Like you get these people talking. You get the chancellor, you get the president. I don't know which one. Like talking to boosters about how it's going to be at Lambeau, and then it's not. That's kind of a huge letdown. You're going from Lambeau Field to the shore of Lake Michigan and having to drive to Chicago. Driving to Chicago, not one of my favorite things. The game itself, do you think Wisconsin has like a little better juju? There's a little better juju at this field as opposed to Ryan Field, where the juju has not been great?
I think anybody who was on the team last season will hear from Luke Fickell and everybody else about how awful they were a year ago when they trailed by 3 touchdowns and got booed off the field at halftime at home, which was the low point of year one of the Fickell era. And if that doesn't motivate you, I don't know what will. I think it'll be a better situation. I know Ryan Field was sort of notorious for how high the grass was and how much it gave other teams fits. I don't know. I mean, David Braun, I think, did an admirable job in year one, given the circumstances that he had to replace Pat Fitzgerald as late as he did. I just think maybe the Badgers can have a little bit of momentum if they're able to beat Purdue and Rutgers, and that feels like a winnable game, and it ought to be for Wisconsin, though we've said that several times over the last decade, and it hasn't worked out.
Yeah. Again, the uncertainty around my feeling about the Badgers is kind of where this kind of I struggle with. But that said, don't want to be a downer, so I'm not going to be a downer. I'm going to say Wisconsin does beat Northwestern, but the USC game and the Northwestern game are ones I don't necessarily feel great about my picks right now. So we both have them 5-2 heading to the final week of October as they welcome in Penn State, the second of the 3 marquee home games that they have this year.
I feel like we're making boring picks because it's chalk essentially, or I assume what will be chalk based on whatever the Vegas odds say, but we got to go on our gut feel at this point. I am going to pick Penn State in this one. I know, at least as of now, they're kind of considered a top 15 type of team. And as the season goes on, a lot of people believe they'll be in the conversation for a college football playoff spot. Now that it's 12 teams, would they be the third Big Ten team that gets in? I know Wisconsin doesn't have a chance to play Penn State every year, but I believe the last time Wisconsin won was 2011, right? Was that the Russell Wilson
Yep. To clinch the Big Ten
year?
title.
Obviously had some good chances. We know what happened in the 2016 Big Ten championship game, but this is a really good Penn State team. And I don't know, maybe the fact this is one of those that has a chance to be at night, right? Was it
Yes.
Oregon
Yeah.
and Penn State?
Yes.
I think that sort of tips the scales a little bit, but if I'm just looking at on the field, I think Penn State will win this one. Now, if they don't, and the Badgers are in the midst of a run here, it really changes what we think about Wisconsin. Because I will say, a lot of people have complained about the college football expansion and how things are going to be different. I think this is a great thing from a fan perspective, especially if you are a Wisconsin fan, that if Wisconsin is like ranked 22nd in a college football playoff poll, they weren't just totally out if it was only top four. I think if you go on a run like this and can beat one of these teams, and Wisconsin's going to have ample opportunity, then at least you start to be in the conversation. And that is what's going to make things so fun.
Yeah. When I said clinch Big Ten title, I meant clinch the Big Ten division. I believe the Legends division, or was the Leaders division? It was the Leaders division.
Yeah.
That Wisconsin was in, and clinched that with that win to go to the first Big Ten title game in 2011. I like Wisconsin. Look, your guy Bruce Feldman has Penn State as one of his. I saw that yesterday. Has them as one of his playoff teams, and I definitely see it. They've obviously got Tom Allen, their new defensive coordinator. The Indiana coach is now their defensive coordinator. That's going to be interesting to see if they have everything fixed. But the offense just wasn't showing up in big games last year. I mean, you go and look at their big games, and Penn State's offense, for the most part, just was non-existent. And that obviously is something that maybe will change in the second year of the Drew Allar era. They got a couple of really good running backs. Got a new, I think Julian Fleming, one of Ohio State's wide receivers, is now there. But at night, late October, Halloween area, right around Halloween weekend, I'm sure that's going to be the weekend that they celebrate Halloween here. I'm going to go Wisconsin. I'm going to go Wisconsin, beating Penn State for the first time since 2011. They've had them on the ropes a couple of times here, obviously. So at least I shouldn't say a couple of times. Once. Should have beaten them in 2021. Had numerous opportunities, way too many, obviously, turnovers in the red zone, including Graham Mertz throwing right to Javon Brisker late in that game in the end zone. So, but I'm going to go Wisconsin. I'm going to say they have gotten on a little run here and get to 6-2. You have them at 5-3 as we head to the final 4 games of the regular season. So the other 4 games at Iowa, November 2nd.
This might be the toughest call for me. Iowa obviously has had an exceptional defense. Their offense has been the worst in the history of college football, but Brian Ferentz is gone, and I wonder what's going to be different. Will it be substantially different? I want to pick Wisconsin in this one. I'm not going to because I just feel like this is going to be a season where it's not going to meet what people want it to be. And so I don't have necessarily a great reason other than it's on the road. Iowa has been really good defensively. And if they're even remotely better offensively or more efficient, that puts them in a good position. So I think this is the toughest stretch without a doubt on the schedule for Wisconsin.
Yeah, no doubt, right? At Penn State, at Iowa, home to Oregon, at Nebraska versus Minnesota. That is a tough stretch. I don't know if you're including at Nebraska and versus Minnesota in that, and when you talk about stretch, but I'm going to go ahead and do it. The Iowa game is interesting. You talk about the offense, the new offense coordinator, Tim Lester, former head coach at Western Michigan, but also spent last year with the Packers, learning their offensive system. They allegedly, according to reports out of Iowa City, running the Shanahan offense. I don't know whether that is going to work as well in college as it does in the NFL, but it will definitely look different. It's going to look different, and whether they have the players to make it work, I guess we'll find out. But I think it's definitely going to look different. Their defense is still very, very good. Phil Parker's still there. I'm going to take Iowa. That's just for me. That's just one that at Iowa, that defense, what Wisconsin's offense has done against that defense the last couple of years, I don't feel great about it. But again, this is all based on the Wisconsin offense of last year, outside of the last game. Like, if they're going to show up and play like LSU and be able to toss the ball over the place and have a lot of success in those ways, then maybe this is a different conversation. But right now, I'm going with the offense with expectations of taking a leap and taking a jump, but maybe not all the way to where a lot of people thought it would be at last year, including us. All right, so back home 2 weeks later to face Oregon, November 16th, in what will also likely be a night game on NBC.
I think we oversold what we thought Wisconsin was going to be last season, and I'm beginning to feel like perhaps at least I'm underselling what Wisconsin could be this year. But again, it goes back to we're basing these on what we've seen in the past and what we think will happen, and a lot could be different. I think Oregon is the best team Wisconsin will play on the schedule this season, and Dan Lanning's done a really good job. And man, this is tough because I think Oregon would win this, and that would, based on my picks, have Wisconsin in a 3-game losing streak. And I think Wisconsin could be in a situation that feels familiar based on the last couple seasons where you've got Nebraska and Minnesota and you're not having a really good season and you can sort of turn it around late in the year. Now, that would be far from ideal, especially in year 2 of the Fickle era, but I keep coming back to how challenging the schedule is. And the good news is Wisconsin will have ample opportunity to prove me wrong and a lot of other people wrong. The bad news is there are some really good teams, and I don't know how you can sit there and say without hesitation that Wisconsin is a favorite. Even if 2 of those 3 that I'm talking about are at home, they're 2 teams that are legitimate college football playoff contenders.
You didn't answer. I mean, so you pick an Oregon then, I guess.
I'm picking Oregon, yeah.
Okay, right. Yeah, Dylan Gabriel, the new quarterback, I believe his 3rd team. And so the offense, is going to be good. The defense I certainly think has some really good players on it. And it's I know it's at home, but Oregon, as you said, could be the best team they face. I think it'll either be Alabama or Oregon will be the 2 best teams that they face. And Oregon's another team that is very likely probably going to be in the playoff. You would think going to be a playoff contender and have a shot at winning it. To be honest, I mean they've been that type of team under Dan Lanning. So I'm going to pick Oregon as well, and it's a good team. It's a good team. All right, final 2 games at Nebraska, home to Minnesota on Black Friday.
Based on where I have Wisconsin at this point, it is the same we've seen the last couple of years. That would be 5-5, fighting for bowl life against teams that you should beat. I think this one's really tough, and for Wisconsin's sake, I hope the Badgers aren't on a 3-game losing streak because I feel like Matt Rule is going to do things at Nebraska and this is not saying much, that a lot of the previous coaches haven't been able to do. I do think he's going to turn around Nebraska. Having said that, this may be a situation where Wisconsin is awfully desperate, wants to get back to another bowl, and I think Wisconsin will win this one. I don't necessarily feel fantastic about that, but if they play better than where I have them at this point, that might change my perspective. But I think Wisconsin will win this one, and probably going to need this one.
Yeah, look, Wisconsin hasn't lost to Nebraska since 2012. I don't know that history matters, but until you do it, it kind of does for me. And when I was actually talking with one of the Nebraska writers for earlier this summer, and he asked me about Wisconsin and just in general, I'm like, they may end up being a much better team. The cliche of being a better team, but maybe the record's not any better. And you're kind of leaning towards that and leaning right on that at this point. But Nebraska, it's Nebraska. Wisconsin has always beaten Nebraska. Until it doesn't happen, I'm not going to pick Nebraska. So I'm going Wisconsin, even though it's there, even though Nebraska is allegedly going to be very much better this season. Prove it. It's kind of like the Wisconsin thing. Prove it. Prove that you're going to be better, and prove that you have the talent, and prove that you have the ability to beat Wisconsin, something you haven't done in more than a decade. So I'm going to take Wisconsin there, and then home to Minnesota on Black Friday.
Yeah, I'm taking Wisconsin in this one. I'm interested to see what the environment is like. In one sense, you have the eyes of a nation on you because it is a Black Friday game. It's not your typical Saturday game. You assume there'll be some pretty good energy. It's a really important game. I love what this rivalry has become. Just as much as people don't like PJ Fleck, at least Minnesota has made this competitive and won some games, and they're recruiting against each other in a it's fun. That's what I'll say. I think Wisconsin will win this game and be at 7-5 to close the regular season. I don't think this is a year where the Badgers, obviously, based on what I've said, will be a college football playoff contender. I don't know what 7-5 would mean is the thing, because that's not why you brought Luke Fickell here. Essentially, you're in the same spot you were in year one. And if I'm wrong about a game, then you're 8-4 and you're still not a college football playoff contender. I think it's a really difficult path to get to that point. If you can win some of the ones we've talked about and beat all the teams you're supposed to win, and you're at 9-3, maybe the conversation is different. And that's certainly not out of the realm of possibility, but that's kind of what I feel about going through this schedule right now, is a 7-5 type season that resembles, at least based on record and where things stack up in the schedule, a lot of what we saw the last couple seasons.
But the football, you think, is going to be better?
I do. I mean, it's hard to juxtapose those two things, because I think you could say if I really thought it was going to be better, they wouldn't be 7-5. And again, maybe it's 8-4. I just think the path beyond that is going to require a level of play that I'm not fully confident at this point, just because we haven't seen it on the field.
I think that's fair. I think the idea that there's going to be a lot of energy in Camp Randall on November 29th is, I disagree. Like, I mean, it's a tradition at Iowa and Nebraska. It's a tradition in several other places where, that day is based around football. It's not a tradition in Wisconsin. I guess you have to start somewhere, but it feels, especially with the struggles that they have in getting the students there to begin with, and then to have it be on that weekend, deer hunting and everything that goes into that week. Like, it's just, I think it's a poor choice. But CBS doesn't care about the stadium and what it looks like. They care about people wanting to tune in and watch, and people will tune in and watch because it's, the college football is the longest played rivalry, most played rivalry. Okay. But the energy in the stadium, I don't think it's going to be great. That said, I'm obviously taking Wisconsin in that game. I have them going 8-4, according to this schedule. But there are a number of coin flip games, as you talked about, right? We talked about the USC game. We talked about, I think the Penn State game for me is kind of a coin toss. At Iowa could go either way. Like, at Nebraska could go either way. There are a number of those games that could go either way. When you look at the schedule, I don't know that I see outside of the first two games, and then and I know Purdue because they just haven't beaten Wisconsin for a really long time. Like, how many of these wins are guaranteed wins, especially after last year where you lost at Indiana and lost at home to Northwestern? Like, it just doesn't feel like there's anything guaranteed, truly guaranteed, maybe outside of those first two.
I don't think there are any true guarantees. And that's part of the challenge that Wisconsin faces right now, is they dropped to a level where those guarantee games were no longer that way. And that's why they weren't winning. That's why they weren't going 10-2 and competing for Big Ten championships. So they've got to figure out how to get to a point where you start to feel more confident in those games. But at least where things stand right now, it's hard to say there are very many. Certainly the teams that we've talked about where they could go on a losing streak, I mean, they're going to play at least 4 ranked teams, I would imagine, maybe 5. And then the teams that won't be ranked potentially are teams that have started to beat Wisconsin or catch up to Wisconsin. And so I don't think there are very many of those so-called guarantees anymore.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I don't want to dive too far into it because we're already a little bit long here anyways, but the folks over at Kings of the North, the podcast, that it's a really good podcast. A couple of former Ohio State guys that do it. I was on it earlier this week. They talk about Kings of the North, essentially all the teams in the northern part of the country, not just Big Ten, but like East Coast, West Coast that are in the North. But this week they did a podcast on tiers, putting teams in tiers, 6 different tiers for this coming season. And the tiers were title contender, playoff dark horse, bowl hopeful, rebuilding, or struggling. And they put Wisconsin in the bowl hopeful category. And after going through this process of picking the games, I kind of agree with it. That kind of makes sense. I was going to say maybe we could have a discussion about it. Maybe are they like a dark horse? But no, I don't think they're a dark horse playoff contender. If they were to win that Alabama game or USC game, then obviously things change. But right now, I think bowl hopeful makes sense. And is that okay?
Based on the categories provided, that is exactly where they would fall. It feels like a best case scenario is that you put yourself in position to be a playoff dark horse. I mean, all anybody I think wants, I know fans want more, but to be in the conversation late in the season, at least based on where this program has been since 2020. They were in the conversation in 2019. Wasn't necessarily going to happen at the end. They were one win away in 2017 from getting in. In 2016, they were in the conversation. That, to me, felt like the height of what Wisconsin football was at that point, and really over the last decade, even though they had some really good teams, but they're not there right now. And so it is bowl hopeful. And if you can win a couple of those games that we've talked about, that are either coin flips or you're an underdog, then you get into that situation, like I was saying earlier, where the college football playoff rankings come out and you're in the top 25, you're 22nd, and you are just in that conversation of if you can win a couple more and a couple other teams drop, can you get into that top 12? But right now, I don't see that for this season.
Some of the other teams in that category: Rutgers, Minnesota, Northwestern, Nebraska. Is that where Wisconsin is in its current life?
I think a lot of people would like to think Wisconsin is a notch ahead of that. And I think Wisconsin might be a notch ahead of that, but that still is below being a playoff dark horse. So that's where Wisconsin's at right now. And they're going to have to prove that they can consistently beat those teams that are in that category to then rise to the next category.
Yeah. Iowa, one of the dark horse playoff dark horse candidates. And then obviously Ohio State title contender, and Oregon probably title contender. I didn't go through all of them. I just went to look to see where Wisconsin was and where they had them. And bowl hopeful, after going through the process of picking the schedule, makes a lot of sense. So, all right. Well, we're gonna talk next week about some of the best games we've covered and we've been to. That was gonna be the ender here, but we'll save that for next week. Looking forward to that because you've covered more than a decade now. I've been to more than 3 decades now, or I guess 3 decades. So there's a lot of games to choose from. Looking forward to doing that next week, and hopefully have some interviews coming up as well. Jesse, thank you very much.
Thanks, Zach.
All right, there he is, Jesse Temple from The Athletic. You've been listening to The Can.